pretend to be Mr. Techno, but we're going to do our best. I've talked with the people who are far more knowledgeable about the stuff than I am. First off, before we get into the slides that I've got, I want to thank Danny. You've been doing this for a while, and every year it just keeps getting better and better, and you bring in great speakers and get us to think about things, and God bless you for what you do, sir. So I want to talk about this subject of protecting Alberta. So here we go is kind of the front or the title slide. And I want to let it sit on this just for a second. Okay, we've talked about the oppression. Barry Cooper's just talked about, the terrible economic deal that we've had. But, the people in High River, you think about that scenario, okay? That was a true travesty, what happened there. And when we've got the federal government talking about seizing 1,500 different types of firearms, et cetera, Mr. Hinman, I know that, I saw in my research for this, you were down in part and parcel of that. That is the type of stuff with which we should not put up. The more autonomous we can be, the better off we are in terms of not being beholden to these types of abuses, where they went outside and ultra-vires above their own law to do what they did without search warrants, et cetera, et cetera. It's terrible. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, I do that, right. Okay, see, I told you I was technically challenged. Okay, so let's talk about policing for a second. We have, Alberta put this in, okay, the contract expires in 2032. However, we actually made sure that there was an opt-out in Article 3.3, okay, so we could be free, according to the contract, by March 31st of 2023 if we give notice by March 31st, 2021. Okay, that's how it works, so they have to get 2 years notice. Now, I will talk later on about how before we've got out of a federal policing contract in a far shorter time frame, but that's according to the way the contract was written based on what Alberta wanted, okay? Alberta pays 70%, okay, at bare minimum. In some circumstances, obviously municipalities over 15,000, we pay 90%, okay? In new municipalities, we pay 100% of the cost, all right? Tom Flanagan, I want to give a shout out to. He wrote a paper with regard to this where he talked about if we had our own provincial police force, we'd avoid the overhead of bilingualism and the cost that imposes in terms of recruitment, et cetera. Yeah, you can clap for that. Okay, you have accounting firms that have done studies on this, KPMG 2003 to 2006, figured out that the average RCMP officer cost us about $155,800 per officer, okay? You see that the OPP, $148,200, Sûreté du Québec, $138,000. They're not a huge difference, but it just goes to show you that having a provincial police force is by no means necessarily more expensive, okay? As well, the other complaints that we get, especially with all the crime and whatever that's been going on, the economic downturn in Alberta, you see people talk about rural response times. I know, for example, when I was campaigning at one point out in Langdon in some places, you had an RCMP detachment in Strathmore, but the people in Langdon didn't get responded to for like an hour, and organized gangs were running havoc. People would work in Calgary, come back home to Langdon and find their homes had been burglarized, et cetera, and there was little they could do about it, and they didn't have enough of the RCMP presence to stop that. As well, there's been a lot of social experimentation going on with the RCMP. It ain't the force that it used to be in the 1960s. It's responded to a lot of political correctness, and so now there's quotas for females and visible minorities. I'll quote this, I'll just tell you. If you're a white male and you want to pass from the first level exams onto the next in the RCMP, you have to get 85%, okay? If you're female, 70%. If you're Aboriginal of any type of, gender background, whatever the discussion is these days, okay, 50%. Those are real numbers. Those are real numbers. Okay, so that's how the force has changed from what you remember it, in the old days, of Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. Okay, it's changed. Okay, as well, the number of employees at the headquarters has grown twice as fast as the actual frontline services of the RCMP. Okay, so these are some of the issues. These are some of the issues that we deal with the current configuration. Okay, so let's look historically. Back in 1874, we had whiskey trading on the frontiers here. You had American whiskey traders coming up and getting away with what they could with some of the tribes up here, etc. So they deemed they were going to send forward a police force. It was about 275 men, I think it was. But it was the Northwest Mounted Police. And you can see a photograph of some of the recruits there in 1902 and some of the insignia and whatnot. Then Alberta had our own Alberta Provincial Police Force. And I want to state that this happened much more quickly than the 2 years that's allocated in the current configuration or contract. What happened was the First World War was on, and the federal government wanted to extricate itself from the costs associated with that and try to free up money. We had only 11 million population at the time. We had 1 million people that were in service at the time during the First World War. So it was a pretty comprehensive thing that was taking a lot of the resources. So they basically downloaded to the provinces and said, policing is your jurisdiction. You look after it. So from 1916 to 1932, so in this transition happened in less than a year. Okay, so by I think it was March or something like that of 1917, we were already running our own Alberta Provincial Police. Feds opted out to policing due to the war. Saskatchewan had its own provincial police force at this time. There was the BC Provincial Police all the way from 1858 to 1950. The Mounted Constabulary Force in Manitoba. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI also had their own. Okay, Newfoundland wasn't even a part of Confederation yet until 1949, and they had their Ranger Force. So you consider the 1920s was the golden age of provincial policing. At that stage, most of the provinces in the country were actually running their own provincial police force. Okay, so when this happened in 1916 over to 1917, 85% patch over rate. People say, oh, well, who's going to transfer over? Would they all go? Well, you bet. They want to be cops. And if you say, instead of getting paid by the federal government, you can be paid by the provincial government, 85% said, yeah, sure, sounds like a good deal. Okay. Quote, this is from one of the articles or magazines or publications I was delving through with regard to this. It gave Alberta the reputation of being the province where gangsters, thieves, murderers, etc., got to get captured. The quote obviously ran off here. Okay, we started off with initially 48 detachment and expanded to 100. We had all throughout that period an 80% conviction rate. In 1930, we actually achieved an 89.9% conviction rate. Okay, and shows there that we had 2,954 arrests and 2,492 of them were actually convicted. It was a very proud force, did a good job. What happened was in the first year, okay, from 16 to 17, we had a number of people who didn't quite cut it. They were brought over an 85% patchover rate, but they found that due to nepotism and various other issues, they weren't quite cut out for the job, so they were fired and they replaced the commissioner as well as some of the people inside the force. But within a few years, 2 to 3 years, we had one of the best functioning police forces on the continent. Now today, we have the Alberta Sheriffs. This has grown over the years. It originally started as basically an organization who was looking after prisoners going to and from institutions like the remand center to courts, etc., back and forth. But at current, it has about 950 sworn members, 16 stations. Okay, you can see the difference in the uniforms here. You have one that has the smoky hat, if you will, which is the Alberta Sheriffs, and then you have next to that you have the RCMP. So it gives you an idea of what the uniforms look like side by side for the Alberta Sheriffs versus the RCMP. Okay. So that was discussing policing. Now I'm going to talk about numbers before I get into the reserve or military component. We pay about $350 million a year for our services for the RCMP. Okay, the federal government coughs up about $100 million. We send anywhere from $20 to $40 billion a year to Ottawa. So for the difference of $100 million, right? Remember, you're spending $20 to $40 billion to Ottawa. For $100 million, you have a force that's entirely within our jurisdiction and our purview, and the premier and not the prime minister, etc. Okay, I would argue, the difference going from $20 billion to $19 billion, $900 million is worth that. Okay, I think it's worth that. All right. Yeah. Now I'm going to get into the military reserve component of this because I think there's some interesting things to learn from that, and I'll go through the numbers on that as well. So the reserve situation. We have 72,000 full-time regular troops in Canada as of 2017. We have obviously some significant bases. We have Calgary, Cold Lake, Edmonton, Griesbach, Wainwright, Suffield. Suffield being the largest inside the British Empire. It's one of the only places where you can do all sorts of live firing exercises with, planes and everything else to mock up for Afghanistan. The reason why Prince Harry and others trained here. Down at the bottom, you'll see we have the Calgary Highlanders and also some of the other regiments that have been very particular to our neck of the woods, like the Calgary Regiment, the Calgary Rifles, etc. I'm comparing now to other jurisdictions. I'm going to use a bunch of American states. All these jurisdictions have between 4 and 5 million population. So there's a number of American states and also international countries, okay? So Louisiana State Guard had 3,000 that served during World War II, and it was authorized under Title 32, Section 109 of the United States Code. So all the states have the ability to set up something like this, okay? The Alabama State Defense Force, 1,000 strong. Interesting history. It was involved heavily in the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. It trained Cuban emigres and actually had secret camps set up in Nicaragua for that. So it was heavily involved in U.S. foreign policy. The reason for that was because the guy who commanded it was also a junior officer underneath Dwight Eisenhower in the Second World War. So when Dwight Eisenhower was looking forward to carrying forward the Bay of Pigs operation, he turned to that man who had served with him during the Second World War for his help. South Carolina State Guard, tremendous history because it's been around since 1670. Just over 1,000, 1,015 that are currently serving. Helped secure Florida in the Spanish-American War in the 1800s. And during World War II had 518 officers and 6,035 enlisted men. Also Strom Thurmond, former senator, was a second lieutenant in this configuration. The Oregon State Defense Force, after September 11th, it had 9,268 total personnel who served, 1,671 in Afghanistan, over 7,048 in Iraq. Okay, so some of these are, pretty significant. The Kentucky Guard, this one has a very interesting history as well again. 100,000 served in the Civil War, the war between the states. It actually has, you see down here, the Kentucky Military Institute. That is not actually in Kentucky. That is in Venice, Florida, because during the Spanish-American War, the Kentucky Guard was instrumental in securing Florida during the Spanish-American War. Okay, so they have installations outside the state for training. Okay, so that covers jurisdictions that are inside the United States in terms of what they do for their own reserves, etc. Now let's look at other countries, okay, that have between 4 and 5 million population and what they do in comparison. Okay, Moldova had 7,000 troops as of the numbers in 2016. Ireland, 9,000 in 2017, 7,300 regulars, 1,600 active reservists. New Zealand, there's two different numbers here. Okay, the chart that you see there has 8,550. Today it stands at about 7,000 because it's been dropping a little bit over time. But as of right now, it stands at about 4,500 regulars, 2,000 territorial force, and 500 civilians. Croatia, 18,000 regular forces in 2017. Part of their history, of course, is they've just come out of an incredibly onerous war in that neck of the woods, Serbia, etc., all the hostilities that are there. So their numbers are high, but given their background and what they've just come through, I think that probably makes a lot of sense. Panama. Interesting history on Panama because Panama was an American protectorate, then, okay, became independent. There's other jurisdictions that have done that as well. The Philippines was an American protectorate, have become independent. Cuba was an American protectorate, has now become independent. Okay, so if somebody opts for that type of route, it shows that there is a way in and a way out, right? But anyhow, they have 26,000 troops as of 2017. This one is the creme de la creme, okay? Switzerland right now has a population of about 8 million, but during the Second World War, the population was just over 4 million. These numbers are truly impressive. So with the Swiss, all people between men, particularly between the ages of 18 and 34, it's changed now, women can serve, but historically it was men. Between the ages of 19 and 34, during the Second World War, and during wartime, it's anybody up to 50 years of age, okay? So they have a regular force of about 20,000. During World War I, they had 220,000 reservists. And in 3 days, in the Second World War, they were able to mobilize 430,000 combat troops plus 210,000 support. Okay, at their full height in the Second World War, they had 850,000 people. When you consider that Goering threatened the Swiss foreign minister and he said, what would you do if the Germans massed 200 million forces against the Swiss border? And he replied back, he said, well, we'd all have to take 2 shots and then go home, okay? Because the Swiss are also incredible because they have Schützenfest. They have competitions for shooting accuracy. So about a weekend every month, they go ahead and they do their training. They will practice their proficiency with regard to long-range shooting, but also all sorts of survival skills and snowshoeing and, you know, cross-country skiing and all these types of things. So they've had 800 years of peace, and you can tell why. Napoleon or Adolf Hitler weren't willing to mess with them, and it's because they were well prepared. And the Swiss doctrine is not necessarily to go and fight battles with the enemy, but to have a mountain redoubt, a national redoubt, so that if other countries were to try to cross the Swiss Alps, to try to cross their territory, they would found all sorts of havoc. So the Swiss, you know, took the idea that they wouldn't necessarily protect their population centers, but they would protect the transportation routes, which meant it would be next to impossible for any country to cross them. Obviously, 800 years of peace is a pretty impressive record. So let's talk math. I know it's only right, as Barry Cooper said, to talk about freedom, because really I think this argument all boils down to freedom rather than just dollars and cents. But let's talk the dollars and cents. If Alberta was to have 10,000 regulars, okay, it would cost about $1 billion. But once again, when you look at the fact that we send anywhere from $20 to $40 billion to Ottawa every year, that's not so bad. That's not so bad. And then if you were to have, say, for example, 30,000 reservists, which would give you a full expandable force of 40,000, when you only have 67,000 across the rest of the country, I guarantee you nobody would mess with you, right? You would be an independent, sovereign, and well protected entity at that stage. So that kind of covers what I wanted to tell you about policing and about reserve forces. I want people to understand that the math works, it's very doable, and when you consider all the travesties that we have to go through with regard to high river confiscations and 1,500 guns seized by Ottawa and this, that, and the other thing, I just want you to know the math behind this works, okay? You shouldn't be intimidated to think that you can't do this or we can't take more autonomy into our own hands, okay? The math and the numbers work. Thank you very much.
Good time for a few questions, or
I think effectively, basically, is what do we do with the military bases? Are they Ottawa's property or are they our property? I think effectively it would boil down this way. Okay, because they reside in Alberta, and especially if you had your own reserve, etc., whatever, there's no way they're going to. You can't pick up and move the soil. So of course the bases are ours. The question, therefore, would be with regard to some of the assets on the bases. Okay, so what happens with the CF-18s in Cold Lake? What happens with some of the troop transports, etc.? That would probably be a fairly easy thing to figure out a negotiation on. To be honest, okay, a lot of the stuff we have is pretty antiquated. Okay, so if the federal government was willing to give us a bargain, or whatever, on some of these old troop transports that are barely functioning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there would be some expense if you said, okay, Ottawa, you take the CF-18s, but we're going to be buying Saabs or some. Some of the surplus materials in the United States. Okay, like when I was serving on this Standing Committee on National Defense and Veterans Affairs, okay, we were looking to get involved with regard to the Kosovo mission or Afghanistan, etc. The United States openly offered us M1 Abrams tanks. We still have these light armored vehicles, etc. We scaled down from having tanks to light armored vehicles. The United States basically said, we've got them mothballed, down in Arizona or wherever it is, and they said, rather than having them mothballed, why don't you guys use them? No charge. No charge. We want Canadians in the field to show moral support for what we're doing in some of these causes. Here's some main battle tanks, go ahead. And Canada was too embarrassed to take the hand-me-down main battle tanks, M1 Abrams tanks from the United States. So instead, we spent a bunch of money to go and buy a lesser quality product with a lighter armored vehicle that protected our troops less. Okay, they argued they were more mobile. Okay, but so what I'm saying basically is that don't sweat that. Okay, they're not going to take the land, and some of the equipment, frankly, we can do just as good, if not better.
Would we maintain our contract with England or Britain and other people using Suffield or stuff for trade?
Well, that's up to us. I mean, I have no issues with Prince Harry or the British using Suffield as a training center, or NATO for that matter, using the bombing ranges at Wainwright, etc. I think that's fantastic. I think that's something that we should be very proud of, because they don't have the space in Europe to do those types of operations. I can't see any reason why we wouldn't continue with that. I'll just let you know a little bit of background, okay? Just because it touches on the British arrangement we have in Suffield. So Canada, okay, back in Diefenbaker's time, we got Oberon-class submarines, okay? But those eventually fell out of repair and usefulness, and they got mothballed. And then Canada was no longer contributing subsurface data with regard to the grid that's maintained for the submarines. Well, Turkey also wanted access to the subsurface grid. So they approached the Americans, because they're the granddaddies of this whole thing, and they said, we want access. Canada isn't contributing submarine data. We don't have submarines. We're on the same level. We're in NATO. We want it because we're protecting the Dardanelles, and Russians, etc. And the Americans were in a real conundrum. So they came to us and they said, listen, you got to get some submarines, because if you're not contributing data, then we kind of have to let the Turks in on this deal. So what are you going to do? And of course the Canadians said, we don't want to pay for submarines, we don't want to do that. So they were scratching their heads and they said, well, what if we give you some, I'm not kidding, this is all real. Okay, what if we give you some submarines? And the Canadians were like, no, we can't accept submarines, just like we can't accept main battle tanks. That'll make us look totally inept. So what happened was, they said, well, would you take mothballed British subs? Yeah, I think we can do that. So that's how we got those Windsor-class submarines. The British had them in mothballs. We got them. We paid all sorts of money to repair and keep these things functional. And it's just so that we can give the Brits a cutback on what they pay for Suffield for their training purposes there. Okay, so it keeps the Brits happy. It keeps us contributing subsurface data. It allows us to do the exercises we do with the Americans at the Noose Bay, where they can test the nuclear submarines against ours or whatever, to see how quiet they are. Okay, but this is kind of how pathetic it is. Okay, so yes, I would love to see Alberta maintain our relationships with some of these NATO forces, etc. But let me tell you, the access to stuff we're going to have would be really good if we don't have this baggage saying, well, you can't take that because we're Canadian. Thanks very much.
Andrew had a question. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
It's kind of adjacent to the area we were discussing, but I think germane. If Alberta separates, do you see a Canada-US style border between Alberta and Canada, or do you see more of a Schengen zone style European border?
Well, just repeat the question in case the other people...
Right, I have to repeat the question. Okay, so basically, what would the border look like? That's, if we separate it, that's something, once again, we have to determine. I think what it comes down to is this, because I thought over it a little bit. It depends on what you consider the threats to be. Okay. In other words, do you fear that you're going to have terrorists, for example, that try to infiltrate via the rest of Canada or via the United States into Alberta? If you feel that that's a serious concern, and that we're going to become a haven, if you will, for these bad actors, well, then you have to have some sort of border controls and immigration controls. That's what it ultimately comes down to. I mean, this is an issue that Canada deals with the United States. Like when Paul Cellucci was ambassador to Canada, he basically said that Canada was an aircraft carrier of terrorists, right north of them, that was planning things. Mujahideen Khalq, for example, was using Montreal as their staging ground. Ahmed Rassam, all these type of people were going down to blow up LAX airport, etc. Was intercepted at the border crossing in Washington D.C., etc. So those are real questions, and you have to determine what the threats are. It comes down to the threat analysis.
One more question, if anybody has one. No? Oh, yeah, here we are. Go ahead.
Where did the decision, the gun grab in High River, wasn't that made in Edmonton?
That's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to let you go through the chronology of that. Oh, sorry, yeah, I keep forgetting again. I think, did you all hear that? Okay, so the question was, where did the decision come for the gun grab in High River? Okay, so I'll tell you how it worked in my time, okay? I was sitting in the office here at Calgary, and we receive regular updates from the Prime Minister's office with regard to daily goings-on, etc., blah, blah, blah. So Paul Hamden, who was my staffer, is a big gun rights guy, he's now working in Saskatchewan. He's working for one of the ministers there. He received the talking points and read them first, and he says, "Hey Rob, did you see this?" I'm like, "What?" Shows me his phone, I read through it, and the first thing that comes to my head, because it was the RCMP being given authorization to seize guns in High River, I said, "Who the hell authorized this?" So I went ahead and wrote a note to the Prime Minister's office. I said, who gave the authority for this? And they got back to me within like a half hour and said, it wasn't us. I said, well, then who did it? So we started playing this game of search, okay? And the provincial guys, you could tell, were not wanting to be all that upfront about what was going on. But what eventually kind of came out was that Griffiths ultimately was probably the one who gave the go-ahead. But they've tried to cover, they had a bunch of RCMP officers who took early retirement packages, okay, because they were the ones giving the go-ahead inside the RCs. Griffiths obviously lost his seat for a myriad of reasons, okay, the tax hikes, etc., blah, 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 all that unpopularity, okay. So ultimately that decision actually came from somebody in Edmonton, right? The Canadian military, by the way, who was also given the authority by the provincial government to do it, said, no, we won't touch it. They walked away from it. Okay, they said, we're not authorized to do it. Like, you may be giving us the authority to do this, but we don't want to do this. Okay, so they were smart enough to walk away. All right, so you had some bad actors inside the RCMP. So, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So that's a problem. That's a problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a very quick question. So if the Americans would give us tanks and submarines, do you think the Canadians would give us an aircraft carrier?
I don't know. It all depends how sweet the deal is. I know, because we've talked about this a little bit. Barry Cooper mentions, what do you ultimately need from the United States, okay, is that the President of the United States recognizes your territory. Okay, people talk, like I've heard people talk about the United Nations and clause this and that and Aboriginal, and if the President of the United States recognizes Alberta, that's it, that's over. Then everything after that is, fine-tuning. What type of status do you have, what type of constitution do you have, what type of military hardware, that's all, whatever. But if the President of the United States recognizes your territory, that's it.